Blog Talk Radio.
Radio brings you The Haunted Sea with host Scott Martis.
Hello, Dr. Bauer.
Hi, Scott.
Now, you were the Dean of the Arts and Sciences at Virginia Tech, correct?
Yes, I started there in 1978.
And you retired in 1999, correct?
That's true, yes.
And were you part of the advisory board for the International Society of Cryptozoology, too?
No, I was a member of the society.
I was a member, too. I was friends with J. Richard Greenwell, who I'm sure you knew.
Yes, I did.
And you started after the demise of the International Society of Cryptozoology, you started your own journal, the Journal of Scientific Exploration.
Well, actually, the Journal of Scientific Exploration had been going since early 1980s, and I was one of the founding members of the Society for Scientific Exploration, which had been originally set up by a group of really well-placed, quite eminent astronomers and astrophysicists who thought that the reports of UFOs, unidentified flying objects, they thought reports of those things ought to be studied more scientifically than they had been. And they were joined also by Robert Jahn, who was Dean of Engineering at Princeton and did very fundamental work in parapsychology. And Marcello Truzzi, who was a sociologist who had long been interested in fringe scientific subjects. And it happened that I had just written a manuscript about the Velikovsky affair, and Marcello Truzzi was chosen as a reader of the manuscript, and he told me about the Society for Scientific Exploration just being formed, and so I had the opportunity to join it. And so cryptozoology was, it was represented in that Society for Scientific Exploration, even though there were not many people other than myself who were really actively interested in it.
Yeah, you see, I was under the mistaken impression that society had started after the ISC, and see, I was mistaken about that. I'm sorry about that.
Well, these societies and people working on non-mainstream subjects are not at all well known, and that's an enormous problem.
And there's also a problem getting funding to study these subjects as well.
Absolutely.
Which explains why a lot of these societies who do good work and are well-meaning like the ISC go belly up from financial problems.
That's right.
That's what killed the International Society of Cryptozoology was money problems.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm sure many people have read your book, The Enigma of Loch Ness, and actually it's one of my favorite Nessie books on the subject. And then I realize it's more than just about the Loch Ness Monster. It's about the external controversy surrounding the claims of the Loch Ness Monster.
Exactly. And in fact, my interest in the Loch Ness Monster actually led to a career change for me. I had started as a chemist, an analytical chemist, electrochemist, but around 1960, I came across Tim Dinsdale's book, and I couldn't get myself to decide whether to believe him or not. And so I started to follow as much as I could, what was happening at Loch Ness. I joined the, what was the name of the organization?
The LNI?
Yeah, the LNI, and they had a newsletter. I was in Australia at the time, and so I was getting their newsletter. And in 1972, I took a sabbatical leave, and we were in Southampton, where there was a great department of chemistry and electrochemistry. And of course, during a spring vacation, I took a trip up to Loch Ness. And lo and behold, Tim Dinsdale happened to be there at that time. And I met him, and I arranged for him to, I later arranged for him to come and give lectures in, at that time I was at the University of Kentucky, in Lexington, Kentucky. And so I think it was in 1975 maybe that Tim came over and gave talks at a few universities there. And then when I came to Virginia Tech in 1978, I again arranged a visit from Tim, and he gave some talks around Virginia universities. And those talks gave me the opportunity to see Tim's film in a 35 millimeter version. And by golly, it's impressive on a big screen in that version.
Well, I'm sure. I believe his wife owns the master copy, correct? Wendy?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I have seen the copy that his son has put on the internet. That's a really good copy of it.
It is, yes.
Probably the best one out there that I'm aware of.
Well, the Dinsdales have been careful to make sure that the film doesn't get into unscrupulous hands. And Tim gave me a 16 millimeter copy, and some people have occasionally asked me to lend that to them, and I've simply refused because amongst the people who want that are Adrian Shine, who is a determined debunker of Loch Ness Monsters.
Yes, he believes that the film shows a boat.
Yeah, which is utter nonsense.
Well, I don't agree with it either. I've looked at both sides of the arguments, and the interesting thing to me is that you see illustrations where they have drawn what they represent to be humps as supposed to be two people sitting in the boat. And
Yeah.
There's different parts of the video that are of the monster segment, where in one segment you see one hump, and then in the other segment they've got marked two humps. So what happened? Did somebody jump out of the boat during the filming? You know, I mean, it's a lot of questions there, you know?
Well, there's also a book, I forget by whom, that has photographs of a boat that is supposed to look like Tim's hump, and it doesn't look anything like it.
Might be Ronald Benn's book, possibly?
No, it was, let's see who it is. I've got all these things here. Robert Binns, Binns.
Oh yeah. I've got both of his books. The one from 1983 and the one from a couple of years ago too.
Yeah.
Which is essentially basically a rehash of the 1983 book.
I haven't seen the later one.
Well, you're not missing much. It's basically the 1983 book, just augmented.
Right.
Yeah.
And there used to be a cryptozoology internet discussion group, and I posted on there a criticism of Adrian Shine's claims about a boat.
Yeah, well, I've read several places that the copy that they're using for their analysis is like a second or third generation copy of the original film that may have artifacts from the reproduction of so many generations.
Well, it's absurd if you think about it. What Adrian Shine did was he photographed from a TV screen from a program that showed the Dinsdale film. He photographed that from a screen. Now, to start with, you then don't know what the rate was at which the original film was taken. But on top of that, you get all sorts of reflections and artifacts and so on.
Yeah.
And so Shine claims digital computerized enhancement, but what he's enhancing is rubbish.
The image stacking procedure. Yeah, I've seen that.
Now, I told you Tim gave me a 16 millimeter copy of his film, and I had the computer science department at the University of at my university here scan it and look for boat shapes, and they didn't find anything at all. They expanded the scan down to the grain size of the film. Mm-hmm. And there is simply nothing to be seen above the water surface on that sequence of the film where it's moving from right to left along the opposite shore.
And there's supposedly you can see splashes like movement of flippers going up and down in parts of it, correct?
Well, there are periodic splashes towards the front, and I'm not sure that it's possible to interpret those exactly. Tim thought they looked like paddle splashes, and they do, but on the other hand, it may be that there were waves coming at an angle towards the wake that was being thrown up, and the periodic splashes might be from that.
Now you consider Tim Dinsdale's film and the underwater Rhines photographs to be the best evidence there is for Nessie, correct?
Absolutely.
And you knew Bob Rhines as well, right?
I did, and you know, for something like 20 years, my wife and I spent a few weeks each summer at Loch Ness in a chalet overlooking Urquhart Bay. And so I was able to meet Bob Rhines when he was there. And I met a lot of other people too, of course, including Adrian Shine.
Did you know Martin Klein?
I never met Martin Klein.
What about Charlie Wyckoff?
Or Wyckoff.
Because they worked very closely with Bob Rhines too.
Yeah, but I have a copy of the letter that Charlie Wyckoff wrote to Discover magazine, in which she pointed out that there had been absolutely no retouching of the flipper. And
my understanding is that the original prints were transparencies, and that any contrast adjustments were done to transparency. So if you turn the contrast up and down, you're going to take away parts of the original image and change it subjectively by just changing the contrast on a transparency.
Well,
so, you know, anything like that could have happened.
I was in touch years and years ago with Alan Gillespie, who was
the remote sensing guy who did the computer enhancements. Yes,
exactly. He did it and he said in a letter that he didn't know what all of the fuss was about because the flipper shape was clearly visible on the original film before there was any enhancement.
Yes, I agree with that statement.
And
very interesting you might not be aware of is that about 5 years ago, they discovered that some plesiosaurs had flippers that were exactly the same shape. They had a ridge going down the middle, and the reason why is that the fleshy part of the flipper is much wider than the triangular bones that you see. In a plesiosaur flipper, about half of the flipper, the full flipper, is just a trailing edge of skin. So it would have that ridge going down the middle where the bones end, and the back end of the flipper is nothing but flesh. So it would look exactly like what you see in the Rhines images.
Yeah, the difficulty for me with plesiosaurs is that it seems to be a consensus that they were surface living creatures and surface hunting creatures. And we don't, and Nessies don't appear at the surface very much at all.
No. We know that turtles, some kind of turtles, can get oxygen through a sac in their cloaca, which is basically their butt is lined with a sac with blood vessels in it, and they can suck water into that and draw oxygen directly from the water into the bloodstream through the blood vessels that line that sac, and it works almost like a fish gill.
Right.
There are some turtles in Australia that get 70% of their oxygen directly from the water that way.
Right. I don't know.
We don't know if plesiosaurs could do that, but they're built so similarly that might be possible as well.
Yeah, did I not send you a copy? I wrote an article in the Journal of Scientific Exploration suggesting that Nessies might be relatives of turtles.
Yes, you did.
Okay.
In fact, you mentioned me in the acknowledgments.
Okay.
About
good.
plesiosaurs, which I thank you for that.
Sure.
One thing that I've always been fascinated with, and maybe you can fill me in on this, is that in late 1959, early 1960, you had no less than 2 biologists associated with the London Museum of Natural History arguing that the Loch Ness Monsters might be plesiosaurs. Then one of them gets fired, and the other one does an abrupt about-face. Of course, I'm talking about Dennis Tucker and Maurice Burton. These two events happened very close in time together, and I'm wondering if there's a connection. In other words, did Tucker get fired and then Maurice Burton change his tune because he was worried about his reputation?
I've tried to read as much as I could about Dennis Tucker, and apparently he was a rather bristly person to get along with, so he had not made many friends, and so it was relatively easy for the administration to find excuses for firing him. But I think that they actually said that the main reason was that his fascination or his proclamation that Nessies were real was sort of hurting the reputation of the museum. Maurice Burton, I think, had taken the possibility quite seriously, and he in fact made a trip up to Loch Ness and wrote an article in I think the Illustrated London News, in which he was not dead set against it at all, but then later, as you say, he became a debunker, and it may well have been in order to not get on the wrong side of his bosses at the museum.
Well, yeah, I'm wondering if maybe perhaps Burton might have talked to somebody and led to Tucker getting fired. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. And incidentally, it was Maurice Burton's daughter who lent Tim Dinsdale that 16mm camera.
Yeah, I think her name was Jane. She was a naturalist too, I believe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, tell us about your book on Velikovsky and how that relates to the whole Nessie controversy.
Well, I told you in 1972, I had met Tim Dinsdale, and also in the early 1970s, there was a bit of a recession, economic recession here in the United States, and that included academic pursuits. We were losing graduate students in chemistry and so on, and the University of Kentucky was urging the faculty to get research grants for interdisciplinary projects. So just at that time, of course, I had met Tim, and he had shown me the Rhines flipper photograph. So I thought it was just a matter of time until everybody accepted the reality of Nessie's. So I put together a team of a philosopher, a sociologist, a journalist, a historian, a biologist, and we put in a proposal to study how the attitudes of the scientific community changed as the evidence came in about Nessie's. Well, it turns out that our proposal was not accepted. It was turned down, but one of the reviewers' comments said, if they want to study the interaction between popular claims and the scientific community, why don't they look into the Velikovsky affair, which I had never heard of. And I decided, well, I had better find out what the Velikovsky affair was all about. And it was a psychiatrist, Immanuel Velikovsky, who had published a book, a popular book called Worlds in Collision, through a popular publisher, Macmillan Publishers, in which he made claims that he could interpret things in the Bible and legends and myths from all over the place to say that at one stage Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, had emitted a comet which had made various voyages through the solar system and had come close to Earth, had produced all sorts of catastrophes like the parting of the Red Seas for the Israelites to go through, and that it had eventually settled into an orbit and was now the planet Venus. Well, it was a very popular book. It was a bestseller, but essentially the whole scientific community rose up in criticism of that scenario. And what fascinated me when reading about this was how incompetent the scientific critiques were. And you had things like a prominent physicist saying, Immanuel Velikovsky's book is rubbish and I haven't even read it. Which is not a particularly good way to get people to take you seriously.
It's not a scientific rebuttal.
Yeah. So around that time, I decided that I really wanted to switch my career from doing academic chemistry to sort of history, sociology, philosophy of science. And I was going to start off by writing a book about Velikovsky and the Loch Ness Monster. One fringe claim, the Velikovsky one, that was wrong, and a fringe claim that was right about the Loch Ness Monster. And it became much too much for one book.
So you split it into 2 books.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, the thing that initially impressed me about the Nessie book is how you explained how the biology community and the marine biologists and all these other, the paleontologists could just basically ignore this problem and act like it didn't exist.
Yes.
Which is unfortunate, you know?
It's unfortunate, but it is a very important fact of life. And I think the underlying reason for that is that science is a way of making a living. And so if you're a scientist, you're not like the old days when people studied what they were interested in. Nowadays, scientists have to get jobs, and they're working for people, and they need grants.
Yeah.
And so they can only work on things that offer a reasonable opportunity of getting publishable results in a reasonable length of time.
Yeah. One person I can point to that is currently struggling with this very dilemma, and I'm sure you've heard the name Jeff Meldrum.
Oh, yeah, of course, yes.
He's gotten so much flack because of his Bigfoot research, you know?
Right, and Jeff has been, I don't know whether he's been a member of the Society for Scientific Exploration, but a few years ago he was given an award by the Society. I actually helped establish the Tim Dinsdale Award.
Oh, I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, and it's given by the Society for Scientific Exploration for people who have done outstanding work on subjects that the mainstream ignores.
I read your paper on Occam's razor and Occam's lobotomy. Would you like to explain that to the audience in layman's terms so they can understand it? I understood it. But...
Well, Occam's razor says that you should first go for the most obvious explanation. And of course, Occam's lobotomy is that you refuse to look at any other explanation. I've written an article much more recently about that sort of thing, that you know, we're the popular culture has generally heard of Galileo and the way in which this individual scientist went against what the mainstream believed, and he turned out to be right. But the fact of the matter is that in most cases, on most subjects, the mainstream is the place that it's most rational, I guess, to go with the mainstream, unless there are very good reasons not to. So there's a saying that hard cases make bad laws. In other words, if you believe everybody who claims to be a Galileo, that is not a very good procedure to follow. It's not good to establish a law that says Galileos are always right. But the opposite of that, which people don't usually mention, is that good laws ignore the hard cases. And Nessie happens to be one of those hard cases.
Mm-hmm.
The difficulty is that the conventional wisdom doesn't know about the hard cases, and they almost automatically ignore people who propose those hard cases.
Yeah.
So what my change of career actually led to was to I was always looking for scientific controversies and trying to analyze how the mainstream reacted to unorthodox opinions. And it turns out that it's quite the common thing in scientific research that minority views and unorthodox opinions are given very short shrift indeed. And people who continue to press their minority views can have their careers severely damaged or even, completely ruined.
Yeah. Well, look at the current status of people's opinion on the science of parapsychology. Some people accept it, some people completely reject it.
Right.
Yeah. So.
But what this has led me to, unfortunately, is that I've become a proponent of 2 points of view that are very severely criticized by the conventional wisdom. And one of them is that HIV causes AIDS. And the other one is that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causes climate change. And the thing is that if you look into the actual evidence, the data, the facts, neither of those things happens to be true. And it's quite an extraordinary thing and very frustrating for me that the whole world essentially believes those two things implicitly and calls them settled science when it's not at all really the case.
Well, I know for a fact that people who disagree with your HIV stance use your Nessie research. They downplay or they make fun of your Nessie research because they disagree with you over the HIV thing.
Yeah, it's guilt by association.
Yeah, I mean,
And
go ahead.
It's really rather disappointing to me. I fell in love with science back in high school, and I find it really discouraging that within the scientific community you find people who are so determined that nobody disagree with them that they will go to tremendous lengths to blacken people's character and smear them just because they disagree with them on something.
You see some of that in the skeptical community.
You do too, that's true.
Yeah. But I have friends in the skeptical community as well, so I mean all the different factions have problems. You know, nobody's perfect.
No, we're all human.
Yeah, you know. But I think before the formation of PsyCop or any of that, you and a lot of those folks were together under one umbrella under the Zetetic Scholar Journal, correct?
And they were under what umbrella?
The journal called Zetetic Scholar, back in the late 70s, early 80s.
Oh, yes. Well, actually, Zetetic Scholar was edited by Marcello Truzzi,
Yeah.
who was a quite open-minded fellow. And he was soon fired as editor because PsyCop didn't approve of his open-mindedness.
Yep. I've read about this. So, what did you think about the carcass that Ryan supposedly found in 2001? Photographed with the ROV.
Well, he was never able to bring it to the surface is the trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, it looked quite plausible, but it needed to be brought to the surface.
Definitely, yeah. They went back in 2008 on his last expedition trying to relocate it and apparently couldn't find it again.
Yeah.
What is the story with the bacterial mats that he found, the yellow bacterial mats? Those were found in 2001 as well.
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, they were like a blobby-looking yellow life form that were found on the bottom of Loch Ness. And they were made with some kind of rod structures. Microbial mats. He talks about them on a certain Loch Ness television special. I can't remember the exact one, but I'm sure you know about the marine fossils that he found.
Oh yeah,
Shells and all that stuff. That's very important evidence right there. That Loch Ness was once open to the sea.
Right. That was a very, very vital part of information. I mean, it was Constance White who had first pointed out that if Nessies are real, they must have come into what is now Loch Ness at a time after the Ice Age when Loch Ness was for a time part of the ocean. And so this was very important proof that it had indeed been part of the ocean.
Well, you probably know I do most of my work at Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
And they've actually found complete whale skeletons and skeletons of seals from when it was marine, from around the same time period.
And there is still now a decent connection, isn't there?
Yes, through the St. Lawrence River.
Yeah.
And then there's a river that runs off the St. Lawrence called the Richelieu River that runs directly into the top of Lake Champlain.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so technically it's still connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know Richard Smith, by the way?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Been friends with him for at least 20 years.
Okay.
And as well.
I haven't been in touch with him for a long time, but I was for a while, and I remember that he was really interested in Champ.
Yep, he's made several expeditions up there. In fact, I'm going there very soon, in the next couple of months, for my yearly expedition. So, what was I thinking of? Oh, Richard was heavily involved in the whole surgeon's photo controversy.
Oh, I must have known it, but I've forgotten.
Yeah. He was over there trying to help Ryan's prove that it was not a model.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the Nova special, they took and built a 4-foot high model of a 4-foot high neck and were able to reproduce a convincing version of the surgeon's photo with a 4-foot high neck.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So he's like me. He's one of the people that doesn't believe the toy submarine story.
No, I don't either. And there's a British cryptozoologist who I think has debunked that.
Carl Sugar?
Yes, exactly.
Yep. Yeah, I know him too. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, he's written some excellent books.
Yeah, there's another interesting photograph is the Hugh Gray picture.
Yes.
One interesting thing about the Hugh Gray picture is you see what appears to be the attachment points for limbs running along the side of whatever this object is.
Yeah, that's what I see in it, and
yeah,
and I accept that conventional interpretation of it, and I'm totally nonplussed by the claims of people like Tony Harmsworth that it shows somehow a dog swimming with a
stick in its mouth.
Stick in its mouth. I mean,
well, the latest attempt to debunk it has been that it's a photograph of a swan.
Oh yeah.
And you don't see. I mean, where's the wings?
Yeah.
Yeah. So So, what made you move over to the turtle idea from the plesiosaur idea?
It's the difficulty of the lack of surface sightings. There are far too few surface sightings, really.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there's quite a bit of circumstantial evidence about them spending a lot of time down deep. Going back to the, I think it was in the 1960s, there were some engineers from Birmingham University who were trying out a new sonar equipment, and they picked up these things that came from the bottom of Loch Ness and traveled up towards the surface and then back down to the bottom.
This was in 1968, I believe. D. Gordon Tucker was one of the
Yeah, right. Yes.
And I believe that was published in Nature.
I don't know where it was, in a mainstream journal somewhere.
I believe it was Nature.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's the main problem that I can see is that the mainstream belief about plesiosaurs is that they were surface dwelling, and that I think the bulk of the evidence about Nessies is that they spend most of their time away from the surface and maybe very deep indeed.
Yeah. Well, most of the sonar evidence would tend to suggest that they spend most of their time in deep water. because you've got, the Operation Deep Scan
Yeah,
pointed in that direction as well,
right. And
Which some of Adrian Shine's own sonar hits, he can't explain himself.
I know. Yes, they had published some of their sonar results that included, likely looking objects that moved up from the surface and down again, up from the bottom and down again.
You were actually there when that was going on at Loch Ness, weren't you?
I was. I was an observer that Lawrence, the sonar company, offered me a fare to go over there and be an observer, which I really appreciated. And a very important part of my observations was that Operation Deep Scan did not scan the whole loch. They scanned the bottom 2/3 of it, the southern 2/3 of it.
Mm-hmm. What was your opinion on the claim that the tree stump pulled up was the object from the gargoyle head photograph?
Well, there was a news conference that Shine had arranged for all of the press people and others who were covering the thing, at which he began by talking about this remarkable bit of evidence that they had discovered and that they would be showing at this press conference, and how they had found this thing on the bottom that was clearly what Rhines had photographed. And then eventually, after all this hype and hoopla, he puts these photographs on the screen, and people laughed. I mean, it was just it was absolutely absurd to suggest that those two things were clearly the same.
And it would have been a time interval of 12 years between the Rhines photograph and the discovery of this tree stump, too, which is another questionable aspect.
Right. I remember several of the journalists being extremely unimpressed and also pretty critical of Shine. Well, Shine is an interesting character, of course. He's clearly very intelligent.
Yeah.
He was clearly also very courageous in what he was doing originally at Loch Ness.
Yep.
But he's just become a total debunker, and things like his attempt to find a boat in the Dinsdale film, is really...
Well, I know there was a time he would give interviews and he would always say, the media monster doesn't exist. What is he talking about? The media monster is the image of this thing that looks like a plesiosaur, which is what everybody, for the most part, seems to be describing what they see.
Right.
So what is he trying to say? That the monster doesn't exist? What is the media monster? The only thing I can figure out he's talking about is the classic image of the Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I will say this. I think he's done some remarkable, meaningful work about finding out about the ecology of Loch Ness.
Definitely. He's done some excellent work there.
Yeah. So we have to give him that, But Alistair Boyd himself, who was the primary guy that says that the surgeon's photo is a fake, had a sighting of his own of Ness. And even he says that they need to be, that all the scientific work they're doing is fine, but they need to be looking at the sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. What's behind that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what happened to Alistair Boyd. He just kind of disappeared, but that's unfortunate. I disagree with him on the surgeon's photo, but, he was an advocate for Nessie, so.
Yeah, I don't know what went on there. It's, I mean, that book was written by Boyd and Martin is a fellow who had worked closely with Adrian Shine.
Yeah. I think he's located in London now, doing something, or he was.
Yeah.
I don't think he's at Loch Ness anymore. There is a marine biologist that's working with Adrian Shine. I'm trying to remember his name. He's written several papers about predicting how many unknown marine animals might still be out there to be discovered.
Oh, yeah, Charles Paxton.
Paxton, there you go. Yep. Yeah. They've written articles together.
Yeah, he's an academic, I think, at the University of St. Andrews.
Yeah. Well,
and he's a good statistician, but statistics doesn't prove things one way or the other.
Well, he was supposed to be publishing a big paper about Nessie, but I don't think it's been published yet. Breaking down all the different sightings into different categories, but I haven't seen it yet, so I don't know.
No, I haven't either.
I guess we can pick up the rest of this discussion sometime later in the week.
Yes, be glad to, Scott.
All right. Well, we've got roughly an hour now, so if we get together and do one more hour, we should be able to cover everything.
Very good. Enjoyed talking to you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
Yes, I'll be in touch.
Good.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, so we're back with the second half of our interview with Professor Henry H. Bauer. Hello, Dr. Bauer.
Hi, Scott. Nice to talk to you.
Yes. So, I'm sure as well as me, you've been curious about why there were no underwater photographs from the AAS and Bob Rhines in 1973 and 1974. I actually found an answer.
Uh-huh.
Ike Blonder, the late Ike Blonder, had a website, and he's got a paragraph that tells why that happened. I'll just read this couple of sentences real quick with your permission. It says, the summer of 1973 was a cold one, so cold that a new automatic underwater station in Urquhart Bay failed to work due to the ice-cold water, which had the lubricant in the cameras to solidify. So in other words, in 1973, the water was so cold, it caused the cameras to freeze up.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, now here's what happened in 1974. It says, next year, the Academy team tried again, this time with another development, the computerized sonar-triggered link to a strobe flash camera. But on development, the computerized, on lowering the whole contraption to the bottom, one of the divers lost his nerve and abandoned the task in mid-water. The station fell over and damaged the camera, thus wrecking the whole experiment.
Oh,
so that's what happened in 1974. But I thought you would be interested in hearing that.
Yes, I hadn't known those things.
Well, getting back to that, one unanswered mystery is why, after 1975, did they not get any more underwater photographic results? Do you have any insight on that?
No, I'm afraid I don't. One possibility is that Rhines had changed in his in the focus of what he wanted to do, and was already interested in trying to recover remains from the bottom of the loch.
Yeah.
I don't recall what year it was that they got the freshwater or the seawater clam.
2001.
Oh, much later.
Yeah. So it was the same year, and a lot of this was on the 60 Minutes 2 segment, if you remember that. They got a video of some kind of thing swimming at the surface. They found the clamshells, and they also found the what looked like a carcass underwater, and also discovered, we spoke about this last time, this kind of microbial mat life form that was a yellow colored and comprised of rods that were formed together in some kind of colony.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 2001 apparently was a very good year for them. And a lot of this stuff still needs to be followed up. Have you ever had any contact with one of the guys that was working with him named Elijah Ercolino?
I know I had exchanged emails with him long ago.
Yeah, I've been meaning to reach out to him. I have reached out. Life to
Yeah.
get really back involved in the whole Loch Ness thing, but he did tell me that he had one sighting and did believe that there was something in there. So obviously he's pro Nazi.
Yeah.
So tell me about who are some of the characters, the famous characters associated with Loch Ness that you may have had contact with. I know you had contact with Frank Searle. What about Ted Holliday?
I never met Holliday. I was interested in what he had written, and I can't say that I thought of him as terribly reliable. I think he was in on one of the exorcism
He was.
things.
He was in the boat
Yeah,
with the Reverend Ormond.
yeah,
Yeah, he had a lot of paranormal beliefs regarding Nessie and connected it with UFOs and possibly other dimensions and all kinds of
right.
things. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the Tim Dinsdale, of course, was the person who most responsible for getting me interested in it. But in terms of other characters, I had a very high regard for Constance White. I think her book was quite remarkable. And I think it was an article that she had written in a magazine that first got Tim interested. And
wasn't she a nurse at one point?
Was it what?
Wasn't she a nurse at one point?
I didn't catch that, Scott. I'm sorry.
I said I believe she was a nurse.
Oh, no, she was an MD.
An MD. Okay, there you go.
Yeah,
And I think
she graduated from King's College, and I believe she had written an article in the King's College magazine.
That's what I was leading to, that the original article was in some kind of a medical journal.
Right, well, she got married to someone up in Inverness, and so she lived there for a long time.
Well, her husband was the manager of the Caledonian Canal.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as she says in her book, she got to meet so many people there who had had individual sightings that she found it completely convincing. Yeah. And I believe that, I think in her book she even mentions 100 people. But anyway, she also did important research. And
absolutely. Yes. Her book was seminal in reviving interest in the Loch Ness Monster after Rupert Gould.
You're right. And her discovery of the second surgeon photograph is terribly important.
Yes.
And that's the significance of the second photograph is really ignored by almost everybody.
Yes, I agree with you. Did you ever meet Nick Winchell?
I did very briefly. I was over there for Operation Deep Scan, and Nick Winchell was there also, of course.
Yeah. So, tell us about that press conference that Shine had with Operation Deep Scan.
Well, Shine had made a big fuss about how there was going to be this press conference and that there would be surprising results and information given. And the room was overly full of people. It was at the Klansman Hotel that the thing was held. And long introduction, and then finally the big surprise on a screen showing one of the underwater photographs, the gargoyle head, and then a photograph of what Shine said was a tree stump that they had brought up from the bottom of Urquhart Bay. And he claimed that the gargoyle head looked just like that. And it looked nothing like it. And I mean, the assembled reporters just gave out any number of giggles, laughs, and sarcastic comments. It was just was perfectly ridiculous to suggest that that tree stump would have been the basis for the gargoyle photograph.
Well, there was an intervening time span of 12 years between 1975 and 1987. So,
yeah, in any case,
yeah.
But you had mentioned Frank Searle, and I think it must have been in 1973 when I was I had a year on sabbatical in Southampton and took a trip up to Loch Ness. And at the tourist bureau in Inverness, they had this photograph of supposedly Nessie, and I asked where on earth they had got this from, and they told me that there was this fellow living at the loch side who had taken it and who had taken lots of other pictures. And so we drove to the loch and found Searle there. He had a big tent with a large number of photographs displayed, and I wanted to take photographs of all those photographs, and he didn't want me to do that, and couldn't give me a terribly clear or reasonable explanation why not.
Wow.
But
well, I don't know if you've seen the expose documentary that was made about 15 years ago, but they pretty much well cooked his goose.
Yes.
In that documentary.
Well, I have to admit that on that occasion, and I think partly because the tourist bureau had sort of given him a recommendation, I took him as being genuine. But looking back at some of those photographs now, it's obvious that they were not genuine, because there are sets of what are said to be sequences of photographs. There's one sequence where it's like a humped body with a long neck and a head with an open mouth, and during the supposed sequence of photographs, the mouth stays open at exactly the same angle.
Yeah, the only thing that changes are the humps near the back.
Right.
Yes.
And then later at some stage I found there was a postcard of some prehistoric animal from which he had just taken the same shapes.
Yep, Brontosaurus.
Yeah.
He also took an alleged UFO photograph as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So his luck was just a little too much,
Yeah. But it was on that same visit that I met Tim Dinsdale, because it happened that Tim apparently had also visited Searle at that time, and so I met Tim on that occasion, and because it was at the same location as Searle's place, I asked Tim what he thought of Searle's photographs, and Tim was very hedgy about it.
Yeah.
And he, as I remember, he said they're very important photographs, which doesn't endorse them as genuine.
Kind of ambiguous.
Right.
Yeah. So,
and of course, what else could he say to someone he had just met for the first time?
Yeah. So, did you ever have any contact with Dick Rayner or Tony Harmsworth?
I have with both of them, and I've talked quite a bit with Dick Rayner, and I respect what he's trying to do. He's set up underwater infrared camera equipment in a number of places, hoping to get some useful images at some time or another. But I mean, this was certainly 15 or 20 years ago, and so I assume that he has not had any success with that at all.
I'm sure we would have heard about it. I know Dick, and I talk to him fairly regularly, so I'm sure if anything had come up, he would have told me about it.
Yeah, so you are in touch with him still?
Yes. And I was talking with Tony Harmsworth, and then he kind of had a falling out with me over the flipper photos. Yeah.
Well, I met Harmsworth in 1983, I believe it was, that he had fairly recently set up an exhibition in the Loch Ness Hotel. And I thought that was a really excellent exhibition. He had a little panoramic, three-dimensional panoramic model of the loch, and information about various locations there. And I thought that he was a pretty pro-Nessie and well-informed individual at that time. I believe by profession Tony was a librarian, and he also had set up an interesting historical exhibition down in Fort Augustus, at the Abbey in Fort Augustus. It was not a Nessie exhibition, I believe, but history of the area.
Well, a lot of this book is not about Nessie. It's about the history of the region.
Right.
And I think from reading his book that he was friends with a lot of the monks at the Abbey. Yeah, so. Well, I think the monastery's been closed for a long time now, maybe 25 years.
Yes, and
something like that.
Well, it's open for tourists now. It's a tourist resort. They rent out accommodations in the Abbey.
Apparently, a lot of the monks had sightings of Nessie.
Yes, and I forget the names now, but one of them even wrote a little pamphlet about it. But at any rate, I thought that Tony Harmsworth was, I don't know, subducted by Adrian Shine.
Perhaps.
Adrian got himself somehow to take over the exhibition in the Loch Ness Hotel that certainly Tony had started.
Yeah. There was a guy involved in that named Ronnie Bremner, too, who subsequently died.
Yeah, well, Bremner was, I think, the owner of the hotel. And I don't know what sort of arrangement Tony Harmsworth had made with him in terms of ownership of the exhibition or getting the benefit of proceeds from it. But in my opinion, Shine sort of replaced Harmsworth. And a number of years ago, Shine and Harmsworth created a board game called Loch Ness Hunt.
Yes, and Harmsworth talks about that in his book.
Yeah, and I think Tony thought he was going to make a fortune out of that, and maybe gave up any claims that he had to the exhibition. But the exhibition under Shine became a very anti-Nessie exhibition.
Yes. You've written several... go ahead.
And Tony Harmsworth then later set up a tourist guide service, and he would take busloads of tourists around the loch, and I believe did a really good job at that.
Yes. Well, now, I know you've written several critiques or rebuttals of various things that have been written over the years. One in particular, you wrote a critique of Loxton and Prothero's Abominable Science chapter on Nessie.
Yeah, right.
Would you like to talk about that?
Well, it's just a dreadful thing. It's not worth talking about. There are too many people who are confirmed supporters of mainstream science, and they seem to take it as part of their obligation to debunk things like Loch Ness Monsters, and they just don't do a very good job at it because they don't know what they're talking about a lot of the time. And I believe that these people are amongst the ones who accept that the flipper photographs are retouched and faked, and that is, it's just simply nonsense.
You also wrote a rebuttal to Gareth Williams' Monstrous Commotion book.
Yes, that was a terribly disappointing book because it's all about the personalities and it's not really about Nessies. And again, I don't remember the details of what I criticized, but I think that was the main thing. And it was so disappointing because he started off by saying that he'd been interested in Nessie since childhood and had always wanted to write something like this. And it turned out to be not very complimentary about people, including Tim Dinsdale.
Well, one of the impressions I got from the book, from reading it, was that I think he added his own spin to certain things that he found out about. He read too much into it and put his own spin on it after the fact.
Right.
But he did uncover some very interesting background information from the writings of Peter Scott from letters.
Right.
So it's valuable for that reason alone.
Yeah.
A lot of that information had never come to light before.
Yeah.
But he did kind of characterize Tim Dinsdale as trying to be an opportunist looking for attention, and I never got that impression from everything else I've read about Dinsdale.
No, I mean, I got to know Tim very well indeed, and he was absolutely genuine. I will concede that he was naive about a number of things,
Yeah.
but he was completely honest, and one of the things I have against Adrian Shine is that in 1984 or 85, when I was talking with Shine, Adrian said to me, I've heard rumors that Tim no longer believes in his own film. And that was utter nonsense, and Shine was simply fishing. And I had the chance to see Tim before I went back to the States on that occasion. And I've never seen Tim so angry about anything. He said that he had heard about these allegations Shine was making from quite a number of other people as well. And he was absolutely furious about it.
Yeah.
But Steve Feltham is a person I've talked with some too, and I think he's completely honest and genuine.
Yes, I've had some contact with Steve, not much, a little bit. We talk once in a blue moon.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I believe he's sincere myself.
But we got to know a number of people because Barbara and I spent a couple of weeks every summer for about 20 years in a chalet overlooking Urquhart Bay. And we got to know the people who owned the chalet, Billy Ross and his wife. And one time, Billy Ross told me that his mother had once seen Nessie in Urquhart Bay from their kitchen window. They had a cottage above that chalet. And like a good skeptical Scot, Billy Ross said to me, well, my mother said she saw it, but I wouldn't believe it unless I see it myself.
Huh. Did you ever meet the Careys?
Meet who?
The Careys, Winifred Carey and her husband, Basil
Oh, not her husband, but I did meet Winifred, Freddie. And in fact, during the first few years when Barbara and I were going over there, I would walk over to Freddie's cottage and spend some time chatting with her and petting the cat that she had. And I met her daughter also, who is an artist. She does portraits of animals for people, of horses and dogs. But Freddie I didn't learn anything from her that I had not read about already, like that she and her husband and Bob Rhines had once actually watched a Nessie moving around just under the surface in Urquhart Bay.
Yeah. Did you ever meet Alex Campbell?
No, I didn't. When I first decided to write a book about the Nessie thing, I sent a letter to the Inverness Courier asking people who had any useful information that they'd be willing to share with me, to get in touch with me. And I had a remarkable response from Dick McIntosh.
I've heard the name.
Dick McIntosh. It's Dick was a nickname, and his actual name has slipped my mind for the moment. But he was a long-time, very well-known lawyer, actually, in Inverness, and he wrote several books. He had been a member of the Navy in the Second World War, and he wrote one book about that. And he wrote a book about becoming a lawyer, and a book about growing up in Inverness. And preparing to write about that book, he made himself an index of the Inverness Courier, if you can believe that.
Ah.
And in response to my query, he sent me a copy of that index so that I was able very quickly to locate anything in the Inverness Courier about the Loch Ness Monster.
That must have come in handy.
Yeah, it sure did. And beyond that, when Barbara and I started to spend holidays over there, we got to know Dick and his second wife, Sybil. We got to know them very well indeed and spent lots of time with them whenever we were over there. Now, Dick had known that my interest had started through Nessie, but it was several years after he and his wife and Barbara and I had been getting together quite often. It was years before, on one occasion, he mentioned that he himself had seen Nessie. And in a rather remarkable way, he said he was a lifelong fisherman on Loch Ness. And he said that sometime around the 1940s, he had been out in a rowboat fishing with an 11-year-old nephew, and that all of a sudden this huge grey mass emerged from the water not very far from their boat, and that all he could think of was to get his nephew back to safety as quickly as possible, and he rowed for the shore as fast as he could, not trying to see any more detail about this huge grey mass. But, you know, to me, that's a terribly convincing little anecdote. He is a lifelong fisherman on the loch who sees something he's never seen before, and it's big and it's animate.
Yeah, that reminds me of some people that I know at Lake Champlain. They run a boathouse that was started by their father in 1928. They've been down there all their life, seen every fish you could possibly see pulled out of Lake Champlain. In 1986, they had 3 sightings all within a period of 3 weeks. Never seen anything before that. Never seen anything after that. But what they saw was your typical long-necked plesiosaur with the neck and head standing up out of the water. They saw it 3 times, that one short period, and have never seen anything since. But they spent their whole life down there. The brother recently died, but the sister is 92 years old. And I spoke to her probably 2 months ago. So I've known these people for at least a quarter of a century. And that's kind of the same kind of situation, you know. They've been down there all their life and only saw these 3 sightings in 1986 and nothing since and nothing before.
Now, Champlain is not that deep, is it?
It's about 400 feet deep maximum.
Mm-hmm.
But it's 120 miles long.
Yeah.
So it's about 5 times longer than Loch Ness, but half as deep. So whatever that works out to.
Yeah.
There's a huge chunk of the middle, probably about 60 miles, that is regularly over 250 feet deep. So that's probably where these things are hiding, is in that deep stretch.
Has there been any really systematic sonar searching there?
There was by a Japanese documentary crew in 1993. And then there's been isolated, you know, work I've done myself back in 2017. We got a bizarre plesiosaur-shaped sonar contact that we estimate was about 13 feet long for about 2 minutes, and then it disappeared off the sonar. This was on a side scan unit. So yeah, occasionally we get sonar stuff there too.
And I remember now, some years ago, I had heard of or had some contact with someone who had picked up hydrophone.
Yes,
hydrophone, some sounds.
Yes, Elizabeth von Muggenthaler.
Oh yeah, right.
Bioacoustician out of North Carolina. Yes, I actually worked with her back in 2008, 2009, and we were able to publish a abstract in the Acoustical Society of America journal.
Uh-huh.
I can send you that.
Please.
Yeah, we meant to do follow-up work, but Dr. von Muggenthaler has disappeared. I don't know what's going on with her. So. But yeah, I'll send you that in an email.
Good.
So what were your thoughts on the environmental DNA survey that just happened at Loch Ness?
Well, I had I emailed the New Zealand fellow who did the thing, and mentioned to him my suggestion that there might have been that there might be some sort of a genetic connection with turtles, and I think the important thing to me, I guess, is to have learned that about 1/4 of their samples are unidentified.
Yeah. Well, I think their explanation, or at least the explanation I've heard, is that some of the DNA was so fragmented or deteriorated or contaminated that it was impossible to get a complete DNA strand from those.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's also the alternative that they may be dealing with something they don't recognize. So.
Yeah, and I don't understand the technicalities of that well enough.
Well, one thing that critics have pointed out, which is very valid, is they got no otter DNA, or no seal DNA. And we know that seals occasionally get into Loch Ness.
Right.
And otters are in there all the time.
Yeah.
So that right there tells you it's possible something could have got through their net. Perhaps something that stays down in the really deep water. I don't know.
Yeah, but what I also don't understand is what length of DNA they need in order to make an identification with DNA that of known creatures.
Have you heard of this thing called the Gen Bank?
No.
It's a database of complete DNA sequences of various marine animals that they put together up at this university in Canada.
Uh-huh.
And it's computerized, and if you get a DNA sequence of something, a carcass that's washed up, you don't know what it is, you can punch in the complete DNA sequence on a computer, and they run it against the database of marine animals that already got, and can get you an answer back sometimes in as quickly as a few seconds.
Wow.
Yeah, so I believe that they run the DNA sequences that they got from Loch Ness against the Gen Bank and probably some other similar databases that are out there.
Uh-huh.
So how that works is they get a water sample, and there are DNA fragments in the water sample. They have to chemically separate the DNA fragments from the water, and then through various chemical tests and processes, they can isolate the DNA fragments. And there's a way to grow a complete DNA sequence from the fragments that are pulled out of the water, which is a replication of the complete DNA sequence of these fragments they get. Then they run those complete sequences through a computer and match it against samples of known animals. That's how it works.
Well, I mean, I know that they have to amplify the amounts because they may be very small amounts of DNA, and this is the...
There are chemical processes they can use to replicate the original DNA sequence.
Well, this is the PCR technique that's used for everything to do with DNA and RNA now.
Yes.
But in order to do that, you already have to know something about the structure of that DNA.
Yeah. You've got to have the full sequence too.
Yeah, and I mean you can't get a longer sequence than the original bit of DNA that you got out of the water.
Well, you know, one thing that was interesting to me is that ahead of the survey, they were trying to figure out a way to replicate hypothetical plesiosaur DNA.
Yeah.
So what they did is they looked at the DNA sequences of crocodilians and the DNA sequences of birds and tried to come up with a hypothetical intermediate sequence that if they got anything reptilian that might be something along the lines of a plesiosaur, they could compare it with that. But they, you know, of course, they have no real plesiosaur DNA to work with.
Yeah, no, they were working very much in the dark.
Yeah. I do know that if they tried the same thing at Lake Champlain, they would get a lot of reptilian DNA because there are several species of freshwater turtle and aquatic snakes, lizards, and even in amphibians. They did get some amphibian DNA from Loch Ness, but I believe they were all known species of newts and toads.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware that Robert Rines back in 2000 Clive filmed the toad at the bottom of Loch Ness.
I had forgotten that, but you're right. Yeah, he did.
So, what are your final thoughts on all this?
Well, I'm still very frustrated because I'd like to know what Nessies really are.
Well, me too.
And I don't see us getting any closer to finding out because we don't have a substitute for Bob Rhines who's going to be pushing every conceivable approach to trying to find out.
Well, you have to look at his legacy. He spent 38 years looking for Nessie from 1970 to 2008. That's very impressive.
It sure is.
I'm sure if he didn't seriously believe there was something there, he wouldn't have spent that much time and effort looking for it.
Sure. No, he was certainly convinced, and in part because he had a sighting himself.
Yeah.
At least one. He may have had more, actually.
You know, I don't have a problem with people suggesting skeptical explanations for the various pieces of evidence. What I have a problem with is when they insist that their interpretation is the only possible one that you can come to.
Yeah, well...
And that's a problem, too, with true believers who aren't critical. It's, it's two sides of the same coin.
Yes. I mean, Scott, over the years I have gotten terribly, terribly, terribly tired of the true believers on both sides.
Yeah.
And, more and more, it's frustrating that there are so few people or organizations that are really genuinely trying to follow the actual evidence. I mean, it's terribly difficult to get really reliable facts about all sorts of things. And when you're dealing with topics that are not in the mainstream and where it's very hard to get any sort of supporting resources to do the work, I mean, it becomes just, it's a mess.
Yes. Let's talk about the demarcation problem, about, where is the boundary between science, fringe science, and pseudoscience? That's very problematic as far as I can understand.
Well, I mean, I've written books about that, and I mean, one of the first things that I learned when I got into this science studies field is that there is no criterion, and to start with, how are you going to define science? If you define it as knowledge based on evidence, then you have to admit that a lot of what is called science nowadays is improperly called science because it's not really based on sound evidence. Another problem is that when people regard science as the reliable authority on almost every topic, what this supposedly reliable authority says changes over time.
Yeah.
So at what stage is it really to be taken as absolute truth? Well, at no stage, actually.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So I should send you an article I just got published about how science needs fact-checking. And, the Loch Ness Monster got me interested in
Well, fact-checking is the referee process, isn't it?
well, it's supposedly so, but where are the facts against which to check something? Global warming is one of the topics that I find frustrating, because the whole world seems to take it as so-called settled science that carbon dioxide causes global warming and climate change. If you go into the literature...
I wanted to ask you about.
You did?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your friend Dewey McClain, the paleontologist.
Oh, boy. Yeah. Dewey was on the geology faculty here who denied that the asteroid extinction hypothesis about the dinosaurs. And it's beginning to look more and more like Dewey and his other paleontologists and geologists were right, that the dinosaurs were not extinguished by an impact from space of a comet or an asteroid, because the extinction had sort of begun already before that event and continued after the event. The extinction was not a sudden thing.
Well, I know for a fact that there is a controversial hadrosaur bone from New Mexico that may be 100,000 years after the asteroid impact.
Right.
It's radiocarbon dated, so
yeah,
there's controversy out there.
I mean, it's terribly difficult to get data for very short periods of time, for geologically short periods of time from the fossil record. But there have been publications more recently about people who have found evidence against the asteroid hypothesis. But, in terms of fact-checking science, if you go into the geological literature and look for data on temperature and carbon dioxide over the life of the Earth, it turns out that there's no correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. And where there is some sort of a correlation, it's along the lines that carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere follow increases in temperature rather than the other way around. On top of that, in the last million years, there have been 7 or 8 major ice ages, and the temperature differential between the maximum of the ice age and the maximum of the intervening warmer period, the temperature differential is between 5 and 6 degrees centigrade. And yet the so-called experts on climate change and global warming are telling us to do something to prevent an increase in temperature of more than 2 degrees. It's just absolutely nonsensical, and all of the official pronouncements are based on computer models.
Yeah. Well, I know, looking at the geology around Lake Champlain, I know that 20 million years ago, Vermont had a climate like Florida does now.
Yeah.
I can believe that. It was subtropical in Vermont 20 million years ago. Yeah. So they were probably crocodiles. I mean, they find crocodilian fossils out in Colorado and Wyoming.
Yeah.
From periods when it was warmer than it is today. So.
Yeah. Yeah, my ultimately, the thing is, there's a heck of a lot we don't yet know.
Oh, absolutely. You got to think, geology as we know it has only existed for about 200 years.
Yeah.
And it's hard to believe that we've figured out 600 million years of geologic history of multicellular life in only 200 years.
Yeah, we've learned a lot, and there's a lot still that we just don't know.
Yeah. Well, I remember in your Nessie book, you talked about discoveries that were premature, that discoveries were made that were significant, but the context in which to understand them did not exist yet when they were initially discovered.
Yeah.
And you suggested that possibly Nessie might fall into that category as well.
Well, she certainly does.
Yeah. Well, we've gone for another hour. Is there anything else you want to throw in there?
I don't think so at the moment. The time has gone very quickly.
Yeah, it usually does.
Yeah.
But I think we got into some really good talking points.
Definitely. And
I really enjoyed it, and thank you for coming on.
I really enjoyed it too, Scott, and look forward to getting your email.
Yep. Okay, then. You have a good night.
You too, and thanks again.
Yep.